It's round 7 of the Tata Steel Chess Masters, and so far, Anish Giri, the Dutchman, is doing really well. 3 wins, 3 draws, leading the tournament field, and he's playing now against one of the main rivals, Nodirbek Abdusattorov. And remember, last year the Uzbek Grandmaster was leading the tournament until one round before the end. And then he lost to Jordan van Foreest, which helped Anish to leapfrog him in the standings, and that led to the first tournament victory for Anish. Now they meet in round 7, and of course the Uzbek Grandmaster, the superstar, is looking for revenge, and he is starting therefore with the move e4. And Anish is in a situation that he doesn't need to take any risk. He goes for the solid Petrov defense. Knight takes e5, d6, knight f3 back, knight takes e4. And so far, very standard opening theory. The main move here is d4 to occupy the center, but Abdusattorov goes for the move c4 as he wants to control the d5 square and make it harder for black to play the move d6, d5 himself. Bishop e7 played, knight c3, knight takes c3, d takes c3. Typical idea, which you can also see in the lines starting with the move knight c3 instead of playing the move c4. Then the pawn is still on c2. Now the pawn is on c4. That gives different dynamics, obviously. Advantage is that your pawn is having more influence in the center, but at the same time, your light squared bishop is also restricted. So we have to see how it works out. Probably this is not the refutation of the Petrov, but you do get a game with playable chances for white, of course. So let's see. Castling kingside. And here, interesting moment. Not too relevant for the current state of opening theory, but Abdusattorov reached this position once before in an online game in which his opponent Iskandarov, a grandmaster from Azerbaijan, played here the move queen c2. Obviously, he had studied that game as well, and therefore he wants to develop first the bishop to d3. Nice square for the bishop, looking at this king. There are no immediate tactics, but it's a good square for the bishop. Knight e7, bishop e3, both bishops are doing well. And the big question, of course, is, and that's actually the question which had to be asked one move earlier, how are you going to develop your pieces? Here, black has already decided to place the knight on d7. The knight has different possibilities. In the game it went to f6, but maybe knight c5 is an idea. Sometimes knight e5 can be considered as well. Difficult to say what is exactly the best. Knight f6 was played in the game. What I don't like about this move is that it's now harder for black to get the bishop out to another square. Like, you would like to put it on f6 and then put a rook on the e file. It looks a bit more active. This is somewhat a passive approach by Anish, although still his position is quite solid. White goes for the move h3, so that there's never any knight g4 idea if that was supposed to be a problem. And here Anish goes for b6. Queen c2. So we have this duo of queen and bishop. One advantage of the knight on f6 is that it covers the pawn on h7. Black plays the move bishop b7, and now, exciting moment, castling queenside is played. So we have potentially a sharp game with attacking chances for both sides. But it should be said that with this bishop on b7, it will be difficult to advance the pawn to g4, to launch a pawn storm, because that hangs the knight on f3. And of course, taking on f3, doubling the pawns, is not really great, because white has a lot of attacking ideas here, can launch the h-pawn, get the rooks behind. That's not what you would like to face as black. So black is not going to take on f3. Anish played the move h6. And here white also got to decide how to play next. I think a typical plan here could be to get a knight to d4 and then to f5. That's a nice idea, but Abdusattorov goes for a more positional approach. Instead, he played here the move rook from h1 to e1. So he's centralizing the rooks. They're nicely placed on the open and half open file, rook e8. And instead of placing the knight on d4, Abdusattorov goes for bishop d4. What is this bishop going to do here? Well, there is some pressure, but are you really going to trade off this bishop for the knight? That's not an obvious decision at all. But after the move played by Giri, c5, Here Abdusattorov decided to take on f6 and he has a very clear plan in mind. He trades off the bishop for the knight, creating an imbalance. Black takes back. And now first we give a check so that the king goes to an inferior square. King f8 or king h8. Both moves have their drawbacks. King h8 is the most logical move, of course. But now the bishop goes back to e4. So the plan is to swap the light squared bishops as well and get a position with a knight against black's dark squared bishop. And that bishop is not looking great because after the exchange, you see that all these pawns, they are fixed on the dark squares. So potentially, strategically speaking, this is very risky for black. Well, still, at this point, black is quite solid. Played here the move queen d7 to connect the rooks and keep the pawn defended. But now, knight d2. The knight was not doing that much on f3 any longer, and it's on its way to e4, from where it does attack the pawn on d6 and the bishop on f6 as well. What should black do? Not easy at all. Maybe a move like queen c6 to keep the pressure against the rook and against the pawn on g2. I think black should be okay, but if I have to take a side, it's definitely white here. Instead, Anish doesn't want to play such solid, calm moves. He is looking for counterplay, but his position is not really made for it, and potentially a lot of pieces are getting swapped as well. So with the move a6, he's planning to play b5 very soon. But king b1, useful move. King is safe on the light squares. Typical strategy when you're playing against a dark squared bishop. Place your pieces on light squares to avoid any unpleasant tactical surprises. Bishop g5. So black is looking for the opportunity to trade off the bishop for the knight. Knight goes back. Bishop also goes back. And here, queen d3. Step by step, white is trying to improve its position and intends to take on d6 at the right moment. Of course, probably got a first take on e8. Still, black can do pretty okay here. If he takes on e4 and take back and then, for instance, put a rook on d8, it will not be easy for white to improve its position. Still, white is better, but it's going to be a long game. But when you play the move a6, it's clear that black is hinting at a counter strike with the move b6, b5. But now rook takes e8. White is trading off one pair of rooks. And black cannot take back with the rook on e8 because of queen takes d6. That's going to drop a pawn. And probably you force the exchange of queens as well. Pawn on a6 is weak. Doesn't look nice. But queen takes e8 is played with the point that now the pawn is poisoned. It runs into the move rook d8 as the bishop protects the rook. If the queen goes away, the rook on d1 is just hanging. So the pawn cannot be taken, but the pawn is vulnerable. It's a backward pawn. And look at this. Knight e2. Nice positional move. The knight is on its way again to e4. While if you do take on c4, the knight changes directions, takes on c4, after which the pawn on d6 is going to be wrapped up very soon. Queen e6 was played in the game to put some pressure against the pawn on c4, but there is knight e4 hitting the pawn on d6. Now, very important that the justification of this move is that b takes c4 is not really helping black. You cannot take on d6 because that hangs the knight on e4. But the key plan for white is queen d5 to stabilize the queen on the light square. You're hitting even the rook, and on the next move, this pawn on d6 is going to be taken. White is much better in that case. So pawn takes c4 not played. Black decided to play bishop e7 to protect the pawn. And you cannot really take with a knight. It always runs into rook d8 ideas with a very unpleasant pin. So white is not in a rush. Slowly improves the position with queen d5. I like this move. If queens will come off the board, then you have a nice hole on d5. It's a nice outpost for the rook. Pawn on d6 is weak. If d6 falls, then probably the pawn on c5 is going to fall as well. Very difficult endgame for black. Well, black didn't want to exchange queens yet. Played here the move rook d8. There's a big difference. If you take yourself on e6, then the pawn is going to recapture, and black has more influence in the center with all these pawns. But white just maintains the queen on d5 and first takes on b5. That's a good idea. Black does recapture, And now, nice positional chess. White improves the position on the king side by bringing up the f pawn. And you cannot really prevent the pawn from coming there, which kind of forces black to make a decision with the queen. If you ever play g6, then, well, white can just play g4. And, well, f5 can be played anytime. The black king can be opened as well. It's very, very difficult position. So black didn't go for the move g6. Played the move king g8. Now f5 is played. And here you are in a difficult situation as black. Because what are you going to do with your queen? In the game, Giri decided to exchange queens by taking on d5. I want to point out that if you go away with the queen to d7, there are no really attacking chances here. You're very passive, and white can even take on c5. Thanks to this tactic on the d file, knight cannot be taken because of queen takes d7, and you do win the exchange. If you move the queen away to c8, well, the queen looks not great at all. There are a lot of ideas here. You can launch your pawn, you can play rook d3, rook g3 maybe play f6. The engine even says that the move a3 is a very good move here to prevent any sort of counterplay on the queen side. But okay, we don't know what Abdusattorov's plan exactly was. Queen takes d5 was played, rook takes d5, and now Giri has a simple plan. He just wants to centralize the king. And if white is too slow, then the king will probably at some point arrive on c6. You always got to watch out for tactics against the pawns on d6 and c5. But imagine the king is on c6, then the pawns are well supported, and the rook will be free to move. But here, white seizes the initiative by playing the move b4. That's an excellent move. Putting pressure against the pawn on c5. If you do take on b4, you take back, and black now has two weak pawns which are under threat by the rook and the knight. So that's going to be really bad. Instead, king e8 is played here. Now taking on c5, d takes c5 does force the exchange of rooks, but the king will just approach. So that's not going to really help. King b2, that's a nice classy move. You're bringing the king, and king d7 is not really a possibility. There are always tactics with pawn on c5 hanging because of the pin along the c file. So instead, rook d7 played. And now, how is white going to make progress? Well, here, white played the move g4. Very logical move to further strengthen your position on the other side of the board as well. But probably the move c4 is really strong. It's an idea we get to see in the game later. One idea is that if you do take with the pawn, then you play the move b5 followed by a4. And you have fantastic connected passed pawns. Black's pawns are just pretty weak, not dangerous at all. g4 was played, and what should black do? Well, Giri decided to walk around with the king, played here the move king d8, but the best thing to do here is rook d8. And now c4, it's not really gonna work, because after pawn takes c4, you have ideas to defend with a rook, or probably get the king over. It's not really clear, actually. But black's position is really difficult anyhow. So king d8 played, and now c4 on the board. It's a nice breakthrough, as white is just trying to create a new passed pawn. If you take on b4, you take on b5, its pawn is protected by the rook, and next you're wrapping up the pawn on b4. And then the a pawn will join as well. So b takes c4 was played. Now, it's not a good idea to advance the pawn to b5 because of king c7, and the king helps out in defense. But the plan is here to take on c5. That's a really good move. And you are in big trouble. One of the big differences is that now after rook b7 check, the king just goes to c3. And the king is really badly placed on the d file because of this pin. Therefore, the king in this line could have been better placed on e8. Complicated stuff, very subtle. After b takes c5, d takes c5 was played, but now the rooks are coming off the board. The king walks into the center, king c3, king c6, king takes c4. How about this endgame of knight versus bishop? It's a position with play on both sides of the board, but white's king is fantastically placed. Pawn on c5 is weak, and white does have an outside passed pawn, and that's going to be really difficult to defend. Let me show you what happened. King b6, a4. King c6, knight f2. Just to reach move 40, you're not in a rush. You see that after bishop d8, the knight went back to e4 and the bishop went back to e7 as well. And here white just continued with the move a5. Nice classy move, bishop d8. Don't take the pawn on c5, because of after bishop takes a5, you'll make it much easier for black. He only got to defend the king side. That's just going to be a draw. Much better idea is to launch the a pawn. a6 plate, bishop e7, knight c3, bishop g5. The knight goes to b5. The knight is helping now. The a pawn, bishop e3. And what's white going to play? Well, various good moves here, but I like this move, h4. This pawn is coming to h5. Very nice technique. King b6. What else? a7 plate. Now you're threatening to promote a pawn, so the king goes back. And here, the move h5 is played, so fixing the pawns on the dark squares, creating new weaknesses on the king side. Black can barely move. King a8, king d5, king b7, and look at this, the king just walks in. And you have ideas of just taking the pawns, as simple as that. And therefore black thought, okay, I gotta go c4. Only chance to try to generate counterplay with the bishop and the pawn. And the knight, okay, he needs to defend the pawn on a7 and also guard black's c-pawn. So here, interesting idea, remember it for future endgames. Now the king doesn't continue his journey, but it comes back. Attacking the pawn on c4, now it's no longer protected. Bishop takes a7. A very good calculation here. You can take on c4, but it's not really going to be enough. Knight takes a7 is a great move. And now, if you take back, it's king takes c4. And how to evaluate this king and pawn endgame? If the king can come over, then it's just going to be a draw. But look at this. This is what Abdusattorov calculated. In case of king b6, there's this idea to play g5, and it's a breakthrough on the king side. If you do take with the h-pawn, there is f6. You're removing the pawn from g7. After g takes f6, h6, the pawn is out of reach, and black's pawns are way too slow. That's just crushing. Let me show you one other typical idea for king and pawn endgames. In case you don't take on g5, but you play the move f6, well, then you take on f6, and the king walks in. White's king is just too strong. King c7, king e6, and you pick up the pawns. And that's the problem in general. There's no time to stop the breakthrough. Even if you start with a move like f6, then white's king is just way too strong. This is the problem dealing with an outside passed pawn. This a pawn was really strong. It deflected the king, and that helps the white king to eliminate the remaining pawns at the other side. So the king and pawn endgame is just winning. Black played here the move c3. Is this pawn unstoppable? No, Abdusattorov had seen that he can come back with a knight to c6. Very important move. Black continues. He's one square away. But thanks to this knight check, knight a5, king c7, knight b3, the pawn is stopped. But still, is it really easy? Well, if you play here the move king d7, which was Giri's move, then you have to come up with a winning plan. If you walk back with your king, let's say king d4, king d6, king c3, you're trying to wrap up the pawn, then it's king e5, and next king f4, you take on g4, and black is going to eliminate the remaining pawns, and that's going to be a draw. So no time to play the move king d4, but the move g5, that is the key idea. Once again, it's again the same breakthrough motive. If you take it, there's f6. And after g takes f6, h6. And that remaining pawn is decisive. In the game, instead of taking on g5, king e7 played. And now the simplest move is just to take on h6. Pawn takes. And king e5. The king is going to support the pawns on the king side. Black running out of useful moves. This pawn is not dangerous. It's just controlled by the knight. f6. King d5. King d7. And now how are you going to win? Well, you have an extra move with your knight. And it's Zugzwang. Black cannot do anything. Black gotta move the king. And then it's just time to resign. That's what Giri did. Let me show you. After the move king c7, the king walks into e6 and the remaining pawns are eliminated. If you do play king e7, it's king c6, king f7, king d6. And the king will be pushed to the edge of the board, after which the pawn on f6 is taken. So, what a fantastic positional masterpiece by Nodirbek Abdusattorov. He's taking revenge from that painful last round played last year in 2023. Now, thanks to this win, he is back in the first place together with Giri and with Gukesh. They're all on 4.5 out of 7. 6 more rounds to go. And we will see what's going to happen. It's a very exciting event. It looks like everybody can defeat each other. It's interesting. Let's see what's going to happen. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for doing that. Appreciate all the support. And I will be back with more exciting games from my favorite tournament of the year.